hope I have enough battery on that. Oh, we should be all right. Okay, so you might want to highlight some things as we go. Unfortunately, I don't really have access into doing that. I don't really know how to either on the board. Okay. The British North America Act founded Canada. Okay, so what came before the Charter of Rights and Freedoms? Do you all know what that is? For starters, okay, hopefully you know what that is. Right. Prior to that, you had the British North America Act, founded Canada as a nation, distributed power between the federal and provincial governments. Okay. The Canadian Bill of Rights was passed in 1960 and it explained the civil rights of all Canadians, but since it was only a law, it cannot override other laws. Okay. The bill was about fundamental freedoms, legal rights, and equality before the law, but if another law was discriminatory, the Bill of Rights could not override it. Okay, so the way Canada's kind of legal system works is that, or prior to the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, from my understanding, is that they would make various rules based off of court cases, and that would then dictate how judges would determine things and what was allowed and not allowed. The Charter of Rights and Freedoms was inspired by things like the 1948 United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. There was also one in Europe for the protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms, and some other things there. Okay. Very fun. Did your pen just explode?
Yeah.
It's quite the problem you got there in your hands. Along with the patriation of the BNA Act, one of the crowning achievements of Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau was adding a Charter of Rights and Freedoms to the Canadian Constitution. This charter outlines the inalienable protected human rights, liberties, and freedoms. Do we understand what this word inalienable means? Probably not. Anyone? Any takers? Inalienable.
Even if somebody isn't a citizen, they're still protected?
Not quite. It's kind of close. I want you to think about the steps which led you to this disaster you have found
I
yourself in.
don't know. I just closed my pen and then I looked down and there's blue everywhere.
Okay, dry your hands first, and then don't get ink on my doorknob. Why are you taking the pens with you?
Wash the pens too so I can use them.
Okay, inalienable means that you can't take it from someone. Okay, your inalienable rights cannot be taken from you. Okay, pretty sure. These freedoms are enjoyed by all Canadian citizens and prevents any Canadian government at any level from passing a law that violates them. The Charter is formally called Part 1 of the Constitution Act 1982, which is the second half of Canada's main constitution. There's 34 different sections. Okay. So the process around 1980s, early 1980, the Canadian government set up a special all-party committee to hear what people had to say about a suggested charter. The committee listened to over 300 presentations from diverse groups and considered 1,200 written submissions. So just for the record, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms is on the back corner of that wall there, just the board. So think for a moment, you have 1,200 different written submissions, 300 different presenters, and they narrowed it down to something that can fit on one piece of paper. Okay, so clearly a lot of voices went into that. There's 123 recommendations to improve this suggested charter. The charter is part of the Constitution Act of 1982, which was signed by Queen Elizabeth II, and it gave Canada control over its constitution. This is a rather important point in Canada's history, where we have our own set of rights and freedoms granted to Canadian citizens, and it's not necessarily through any other government. Okay. charter applies to all levels of government. It forms part of Canada's constitution, which is the highest law in Canada. No other laws can violate the constitution. Which means that if you are at the provincial level, you cannot make a decision, you cannot input a law that violates some of those rights. Which, for the record, is very flexible, because the first part of the charter states that, you know, they can limit or reduce any of those rights and freedoms if it's found to be necessary in a democratic society. So for many of us, we likely experienced that during the COVID lockdowns and whatnot, where many Canadians' right for freedom of movement was restricted or removed, and amongst a number of other things. The most controversial charter issues will be heard by the Supreme Court of Canada. That's all the way at the highest level. The Supreme Court decides on the limitations of our Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Some laws will be overturned because they violate the charter. I'm gonna post a link to the Canada Guide, which you can kind of peruse through later on. So rights versus freedoms. So a right is a legal, moral, or social expectation that Canadians are entitled to from the government. Once again, I'll reiterate very specific difference, key difference between, let's say, the Canadian Charter and American Constitution. In America, unlike many other Western countries, your rights are given to you from God. They're inherent within you. They're inalienable because they're given to you from God. Whereas in other countries, let's say like Canada, I know in France, very specifically it states this, and England as well, I want to say. I could be wrong on England. Those rights are given to you by a government. So if they're given to you by a government, they could perhaps be taken away from you by a government. Freedom is a right to live your life without interference from the government unless you impinge on the freedom of others. Okay, do you understand what impinge means?
Change the lives of others or something?
Yeah, like if it has an impact, right? So everyone has the right and freedom to live, which means that you can't, you know, kill someone. Okay, it's illegal. You may have a legal right once you've proven you're capable of. You may have a legal right to drive a vehicle. That doesn't give you the freedom to drive it through someone's living room. Okay. My high school social studies teacher used to phrase it this way. He would say that the rights of my fist end at the tip of your nose. Okay. So whatever I want to do, I can do as long as it doesn't impinge upon you. Okay. Unless you commit a crime, and then, you know. Okay. There's 5 charter freedoms. The 5 charter freedoms. So this is section 2 charter. You have freedom of conscience and religion, the freedom to practice any religion and participate in its rituals, as well as avoid activities that violate one's religious beliefs. Freedom of conscience is slightly different than that. I don't know why it didn't hint on that as well. From my understanding, so freedom of conscience is a bit abstract. It's kind of like, from what I recall, and I would need to review this a bit, it's basically like you're allowed to make decisions just because, right? Now again, it still falls under the umbrella that, oh, you know, I wanted to, you know, going back to, how many of you know what a Greyhound bus is? Right? Okay. Yeah, there was a guy who's on a Greyhound bus, was traveling between cities. These buses are large coach buses, and some guy attacked him and then cut his head off, right? Killed him and cut his head off, right? Started eating him as well, cannibalized him, right? Now that guy in court, his lawyer argued insanity, but his claim was that, you know, some voices told me to do that. So that's not freedom of conscience, right? You know, it's impinging on someone else's right and freedom to live. This is like before you kids were born, I think.
And he's out.
Yeah.
As we speak, he is roaming the streets of Winnipeg.
He is in large.
Yeah.
He's in Canada?
Yeah.
Yep, he is out.
Very interesting, controversial case. So freedom of conscience and religion are slightly different, right? So actually, I think a good example of freedom of conscience would be like, you're free to think that the earth is flat. Okay? You're allowed to do that, right? Okay. You're free to think that gravity is fake, but you're not free and allowed to, you know, push people off a building because you think gravity isn't real, okay? Freedom of thought, belief, opinion, and expression. Some people would argue that this is one of the most important freedoms of all of them, the freedom to speak or think ideas relating to any perspective on any topic. You kids live in a very interesting time. Where people get canceled for things that they say. Okay, or things that they do. Now again, things that you do can depend, right? Because freedom to do something is limited by someone else's right and freedoms as well, right? So I'm free to swing my arms like this until someone's within hitting distance, okay? Then I get in trouble. Okay? But the freedom of thought, like just to have a thought in your mind, right? And if you don't think people can police that, like, you know, it'd be worthwhile to read a book on, you know, communist China or Russia. It's very fascinating how they did this. Or you go and learn about Nazis in Germany and how people would have propagated that, right? Freedom of belief. So this kind of is separate from religious belief. Like you're allowed to believe what you want to believe. Freedom of